start letting people in, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or the Zoom webinar. And so we're just going to wait a minute or two, and then we will have a brief introduction, and then we'll get straight off onto the event. So if you are watching this, you have come to the right place. This is JW3, and we will be going live in a couple of minutes. So welcome to everyone as you're starting to log on. I'm starting to see the numbers as people are entering the room. Don't worry, we haven't started. We're not going to start until 8 o'clock. We'll give it a minute or two to allow everybody into the Zoom webinar room. And there are a significant number of people now already logging on via Facebook and via YouTube. So we're going to wait for a couple of minutes as people join us. I welcome you all. Get yourself comfortable, make sure that you can hear me, make sure this is just really a test to make sure that you can see and hear me. I'm getting the message from my colleagues that it's coming out loud and clear. So if you are having a problem, I'm afraid it's probably at your end with your internet. Make sure you've got all your settings right. And in a moment or so, we are going to go live and then we will begin. So there's a lot more people joining the room as we go along. Okay, so there are more and more people joining by the second. I can see the little ticker at the bottom of my stream as the numbers are going up and up. So I will actually just start really slowly so that everybody can have time to squeeze in to the Zoom room or on Facebook or on YouTube where people are joining us from. It's quite incredible, although I guess not surprising, that we have all 500 places on the Zoom webinar were booked very quickly within a day or two. So there are 500 people joining us on the webinar and a couple of thousand other people joining us as we speak via Facebook or YouTube. So I think I'm going to begin, and hopefully there's enough people already settled in that can hear this. So good evening, everyone. My name is Raymond Simonson. I'm very proud to be the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre. Normally when I introduce any event or welcome people, I like to say lots of wonderful things about how great JW3 is and other activities we've got going on. I'm not going to do that this evening. We also normally end these kind of events by doing a pitch, a fundraising pitch for JW3. We're not going to do that this evening. As you know, this was a free event, and many of you have been telling me that instead of, as you didn't have to pay a ticket price, you've donated the equivalent of a ticket price to one of the organisations you've seen that are involved with the Black Lives Matters movement. And it's possible that some of our speakers tonight might recommend those to you for if you want to make a donation afterwards. So welcome and thank you for joining us. It's been a difficult week for everyone, I know, wherever it is that you are watching. And our team here at JW3, particularly my colleagues Deborah and Joe, were adamant at the start of the week that we needed to do something, and we needed to do it as swiftly as we could. And our aim was to follow in the suit that JW3 has always approached things. We always aim to increase the quality, the variety and the volume of Jewish conversation. And this is an issue where the quality of that conversation and the need to turn the volume up seems absolutely critical. So our aim this evening was really to bring together some really high quality contributors to add their voices, and for us to have a conversation which at times might be a difficult conversation, and that's okay. And the reason we're doing this, I think, can be summed up really in the words of the late great Holocaust survivor and writer and activist Elie Wiesel. And many of you will know this quote. Elie Wiesel said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. Because of indifference, one dies before one actually dies. To be in the window and watch people being sent to concentration camps or being attacked in the street and do nothing, that's being dead." And Elie Wiesel was echoing that biblical injunction to not stand idly by the shedding of the blood of your neighbour. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. It's these Jewish values that have led us at JW3 to want to be involved in starting a conversation to help many of you have these conversations. So we're really delighted to have pulled together at really short notice a great panel of experts. In fact, the very first names we wrote down on a piece of paper the other day, every single person said yes. I'm just going to have a very brief introduction to them and then hand over and they'll start. So we have tonight April Baskin, who some of you like me met in the UK last December at Limurd. She is absolutely fantastic, a leading American Jew of colour, the Racial Justice Director of Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. I'm delighted that she's joining us this evening, along with the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, who will be joining us a little bit later. He's a Member of Parliament for Tottenham, where he's built extremely close relationships with Jewish communities, particularly in Stamford Hill. We have the journalist Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, a former president of the Cambridge University Student Union's Black and Minority Campaign. I'm so glad that Nadine's joined us. And Lord Simon Woolley, CBE, a real inspiration to me. He's the founder and director of Operation Black Vote, and he was made a crossbench member of the House of Lords by Theresa May. I don't know if Simon remembers, but he inspired many young Jewish youth leaders when he addressed groups for seminars I was running, anti-racism seminars 15 and 20 years ago. So it's great to have him. And in our chair seat this evening, I'm going to take a back seat and hand over in a moment to our moderator for this evening, the indefatigable Dr. Edie Friedman, who is the founder, director, and beating heart of JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, who I'm delighted are our partners for this evening and who have worked with us to put this superb panel together. Just one technical note for everyone. The chat feature in Zoom has been disabled. So please, if you have any questions or comments throughout, don't have to wait till the end. Just type them in the Q&A box. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. If you type them in there, a couple of the JW3 colleagues are going to try and sift through those questions and pass them on to the panelists. We will try and address as many of them as we can. Apologies, we can't get to everyone's. If you're watching on Facebook Live or on YouTube, please type your questions in the comments. Even if our panelists can't get to them, feel free to have those conversations between you. So that's where I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to hand over now to Edie and our panel and say thank you, Edie.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and good evening to everyone. As Raymond has said, it's really gratifying to see the amount of interest that this event has attracted. And it's really important that we don't lose the momentum of this moment. The shocking murder of George Floyd, which has resonated across the world, will hopefully help us to look more critically at our own backyard and what changes that we need to make. And COVID-19 has laid bare some very uncomfortable truths about racial equality in both our countries. So this is not just about the United States, but this is also about us as well. And it's really important that we see that this is not just a one-off event, but one that we hope galvanizes us to demand that our government and our institutions actually make real change. Inevitably, as we just have over an hour to explore a number of very complex issues, that this will only scratch the surface tonight, but it's really important that this very long overdue conversation actually continues. And to help us do so, I'm really delighted by the panel that we've got together for this evening. You've heard their introductions. There's April, who is joining us from Senegal. She's the Racial Justice Coordinator for the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable in the United States. And the journalist who I met a few months ago when life did seem a bit more normal than it does now, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, president of the Cambridge Union Black and Ethnic Minority Campaign, and someone I came across in her articles in The Guardian exploring racism. Lord Simon Woolley, an old friend from many years, director of Operation Black Vote, and as you heard, Theresa May asked him to head up this very important unit looking at racial disparity within the UK. And we'll be joined a bit later by David Lammy, who has been the MP for Tottenham since 2000 and is currently Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. Tonight, I'll be asking each of our panelists a very specific question, and then I will ask all of them, to suggest what practical steps we can take so that we can actually make some tangible and some long-lasting change. And finally, we'll have time for some questions from you, the audience. So to kick off, welcome to April from Senegal, or currently based in Senegal. April is a multiracial Jewish woman based, when she's not in Senegal, in the United States. And April, I'd like you to comment, albeit briefly, on racism generally in the United States, and more specifically on Black-Jewish relations. And I realize this is a really very tall order, but I think it's really useful and important for you to help us formulate some thinking on this issue during a week when we've really been inundated with so many different reports about what is happening. And it would really be useful if you could help elucidate and help us through all these headlines and contradictions and emotions that we've all had to contend with this week. So, April.
And about how many minutes would you like me to speak here?
Well,
2 minutes, 3 minutes?
Because we have a lot to get in, and there are...
That's fine. I just want to know my container.
5-ish minutes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Great. And feel free, if I have about a minute or so left, to let me know, or if you say that's about time, if you just wave your hand, I'll take the cue, okay? So that is a tall order, but I'm honored and so happy to be here with all of you. It actually is a lovely contradiction to the pain and terror that that the events of the last few weeks has elicited for me personally. So it's really a joy. Let's see here. So racism in the US. I think what's coming up for me that's most important to say in this moment from my vantage point is that America is grappling with what Professor Joy DeGruy refers to as post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And she posits in her research and in her scholarship that until America deals with this fundamental and enduring 400+ year trauma and set of atrocities and dehumanization, until that's actually really addressed, it's going to continue to show up and reverberate in all kinds of ways, in ways that quite mirror what was happening on the plantation during slavery, like the murder of George Floyd. That was just explicit and incredibly dehumanizing and horrific, and was a scene that is quite familiar to a number of African-American folks in the States and anyone who has seriously studied the context of slavery. And so what I would put forth is that a challenge for America that I do think, and a number of people think, is surmountable, but that I think in the collective consciousness of a lot of what America seems insurmountable, is that we need to go back and engage in profound teshuvah, or repentance, and healing work, in tikkun and teshuvah, and healing and repentance, and reconcile this, go through a truth and reconciliation process that has never fully taken place in the United States around this issue. And until that happens, and until there is a reconciliation and some type of process around reparations and some type of process of correcting the harm that was done to everyone involved in that system, because any form of oppression not only dehumanizes the target group, it also dehumanizes everyone who is in the non-target group. So fundamentally, I think that that's part of the tension that we're dealing with, is because that hasn't happened. And I think it's a little different in the UK. Obviously, there is racism and issues in the UK, but when I visited last December, I noticed that it was palpably better in certain areas than I find it is in the States. And I think part of that is because, at the very least, the UK has a history that predates slavery and colonization, has some sense of their identity beyond that start point, where that is part of the origin of the US. And I think we're gonna need to find a way to resolve that, or things are going to continue to fall apart and get worse. And in terms of Black-Jewish relations and dynamics, there's so much to say there. And as someone who is deeply a part of both communities, I think one of the things that needs to be done, since I'm speaking with a Jewish audience, and that's where I spend a lot of time professionally, is finding more productive ways of noticing the differences culturally and historically, of noticing what's distinct, where are similarities, what are the distinct differences in the way that anti-Semitism operates versus racism. Because I think that there's an effort or a desire to smooth things over or to apply a universalism that doesn't work for Black folks. And there are core differences around how racism operates today that needs to be named and addressed and accounted for. And I think another component, which is more difficult in some ways, is that the Jews as well carry a lot of collective trauma, and that because of the specific way anti-Semitism works, we both have a higher status in general in society as a collective. There are a lot of working class Jews. I don't want my words to be misunderstood, but so there's a sense and an expectation, even among Jews of color within the community, that the community should take more action. And because of the residue of intergenerational trauma around things like the Holocaust and the Shoah and pogroms, that Jews are very afraid at times to act in the States. And I think that they don't know the full extent where they can take action before they receive backlash. But right now, people of color are dying, and it's really important that, in addition to a number of the people in the Jewish community, at least I'm speaking from my perspective for being as a USer, to be clear. So if things apply and don't apply in the UK, I will let my colleagues address that, but I want to be clear that that's the lane that I'm staying in here. And so there's a desire from a number of Jews of color to, first of all, address the racism that's taking place within our own community and that we ourselves are experiencing. And there's also a desire among many Jews of color, as well as our Black family members and colleagues and friends, for members of the broader Jewish community to be more courageous about stepping up. Now, what's interesting about this moment that I can't speak about fully yet, because I still gathering the full ramifications, is that I can tell that more Jews in this moment, white Ashkenazi Jews, are stepping up, but how many and to what extent, since it's only been in the last week, I can't fully ascertain that. So there is movement in that direction, which is a good step. There's more I could say, but I think I may stop there for now. Is that okay, Edie?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it would really be useful to explore this whole idea about truth and reconciliation. I mean, as we know, in South Africa, people who were actually involved in apartheid. And if we're looking at something that is helping people come to terms with slavery, obviously the direct experience isn't there. So it's really going to take, it's really a huge challenge, isn't it? But, maybe this is one way that Black-Jewish relations can get more further developed. But it is really going to require a lot of creativity and a lot of rethinking about what is the most appropriate model. So Nadine, welcome. As a Black Jewish young woman activist in Britain, what do you think are the sort of key issues for your generation of activists? And do you feel that they differ from those of the past?
So when it comes to the key aims of racial activism now, I think it's about making sure that communities are in solidarity with each other rather than being apart. I think during the election, which was really good, kind of an example to talk about, was there wasn't that union where Jews were standing in solidarity with Black people towards a shared challenge of racism. And I think I was part of a group called, whatever your political views are, we were part of a group called Jews Against Boris, but part of the purpose of it was to highlight that solidarity in the fight against racism is the only way you're truly ever going to get rid of racism. So if you're just standing there saying, I'm fighting anti-Semitism on this hand, and you're not fighting anti-Blackness on the other, and vice versa, you're never actually going to get rid of racism. You're just breaking it up and actually dividing yourselves, which makes it easier for racists to win because it's dividing and conquering. So I think the biggest challenge for my generation is to try and shine a light on the importance of solidarity and the importance of standing with communities as a whole, regardless of what form of oppression it is, which is why this sort of event is so important, because it demonstrates that there is that will within the Jewish community now to say to the Black community, listen, we're going to stand with you against this form of hate and this form of oppression, which I feel has not been happening on a big enough scale really ever. So the fact that it's happening now, and the fact that there's this kind of united front and this recognition within the Jewish community that we have not been doing enough to support not just Black people but Black Jews, which I could say a lot about, but it's that, I think that's the biggest challenge for our generation, is to push forward. Don't just focus on one form of racism, focus on them all, because that's the only way you're ever going to get proper change, long lasting and sincere change.
And do you feel there's anything in the past in terms of Black Jewish relations which inspire you today, or do you feel that people were not necessarily on the right road?
So for me, and people that know me know that for me the election was quite quite traumatic time, purely because there was obviously a lot of issues from anti-Semitism to anti-Black racism going on across the political spectrum. And I felt that I was trying to straddle trying to fight for two camps that weren't united and weren't, aware of the other. More so within the Jewish community, I wrote to Jewish communal organisations asking for support for Black Jews. I contacted some Jewish religious leaders asking for support for Black Jews and for solidarity between communities, and it just wasn't happening. And that for me was really, really, really difficult, and very, very difficult. And anybody that knows me during the election knows I was very upset. And even when it comes to the Jewish press, the way the Jewish press were handling the issue, there wasn't that solidarity and that awareness. So again, as I said, that this event is something I'm really excited about, because a lot of people are gathering, a lot of Jewish people are going to be watching and learning about what I was trying, and what a lot of other Black Jews were trying to say during the election. Stand together and solidarity is important.
Right. Simon, greetings to you. Why do we have a race disparity unit?
Well, before I touch on that, I really want to pay my respect both to you, Edie. Many of the listeners might know that we've been collaborating for 20 years. We
were children, of course, Simon.
Yes, no grey hair. But Edie and I, we helped form an organization called the Black Jewish Forum over 20 years ago. And it was Africans, Asians, Caribbeans, and Jewish individuals, many intellectuals, many activists. And we had a sense of solidarity, actually the likes of which we really need right now. We listened to each other, we learned from each other, and we supported each other. When Edie Friedman would call me up, anytime in fact, including this time, my opening gambit would be, yes, Edie, now what's the question? Because I couldn't say no to her, because I also knew that she was always at the forefront of struggles. And she said to me last week, listen, Simon, we need to talk to the Jewish community about what's happening in the States and COVID here. Will you help? I also want to pay tribute to Raymond Simonson. Back in the day, he would call me up to go to Jewish schools and he'd say, listen, Simon, talk to our students about life in your shoes, because unless we share those stories, we can never begin to empathize and understand the world we live in. If there's a mountain like this, there's two sides to the mountain. And when you tell the stories, you can see all sides. Being amongst my sisters, April and Nadine, gives me very great pleasure. It's normally the women at the forefront doing the heavy lifting, and us men get to talk, and then women say, actually get back, we can talk too. But it's great to be here. Now look, historians will look back at this time, 2020, and see this perfect storm of COVID-19 and the shocking, brutal murder, lynching of an unarmed Black man, George Floyd. They will see our cities burning. They will see our communities outraged and see politicians scrambling what to do. And they will look back and they will ask one question. What was our response? How did we respond to these tumultuous occurrences? And I think really there's one of three responses that we can do. One is clearly nothing, head in the sand, hope it all blows over. Two is do a little, you know, something's wrong, institutional racism, let's do a few tweaking here, and then get back to normal. Or three, the third option is in many ways, Edie, to have a 1945 moment. A 1945 moment after the world was broken on its knees, and we begun to rebuild our societies, fundamental rethink that offered greater equality, greater unity. Institutions, ask yourself, what is the greatest institution that the UK have produced since the Second World War? I'll tell you, the National Health Service, an institution that we are proud of today because it's free at the point of entry. We now need that 1945 moment where we are bold enough, where we are brave enough to say, not only must we not go back to the old norm, because the old norm wasn't great, but we need to create a new norm with institutions that are more inclusive, more dynamic, much more fairer. What this disease has done, and the death of George Floyd, is that it has this ability to expose and amplify the deep-seated inequalities. Many of those deep-seated inequalities are racial. Inequality in health, inequality in employment, inequality in the criminal justice system, inequality in education. If we do little or nothing, Edie, as we come out of this crisis, where we'll face an economic downturn, both in the United States and in the UK, an economic downturn we haven't seen for generations, those very people that have been hit hard now, poorer people, predominantly Black people, will be hit hard again. That's why we need that 1945 moment. Look, I looked on my shelf before I came to this meeting, because I know that there would be lots of Jewish viewers, and know lots of Black viewers too. And look what I found. I'm not sure whether you can read that on the screen, but it was published about happenings that happened when I was born, 1961. Please don't do the calculation. The Freedom Riders, and I met the writer Raymond Arsenault. In this book is the Bible, if you like, of activism from Black youths, from Jewish youths, from white youths, from people that saying we must come together to change our world. And you know, look at the bus. The bus was on fire, fire bombed. Now let me tell you this. There'll be no more fire bombing, but it won't be a walk in the park. I'll leave it at this because I want a conversation. I see my brother David Lammy in his background with his white shirt. Nice to see you, David. Out of this crisis, Edie, out of this awfulness, we must rebuild bigger and better. I want us to be so brave, so bold, that we construct a new social and race equality contract, looking at all those systemic areas that have let our communities down, to be rebuilt, stronger, fairer, wiser. If we don't, in this country, approximately 50,000 people will have died. We will not do them justice. We would not have done them justice for future generations. To all your listeners, the many thousands out there, Black and white, I'm asking you, every single one of you, Black and white, male or female, stand up and be a leader. Stand up show solidarity with us. Tell anyone that will listen, we're not asking for social and racial justice. We're not asking, we're demanding it. Thank you, Edie.
Simon, before handing over to David, could you just say something about the race disparity unit? Because there will come a time when everything is out of the headlines again. And when the unit was, when you created it, when you were asked to chair it, these issues had a different sort of profile than they have now. Yeah. And I think we can't lose sight of that.
Well,
and what was it that led to Theresa May asking you to head this and even creating it in the first place? Because we have to go back to that, because we know that these sort of things cannot be sustained.
You're right.
At this level of headlines as we see today.
And
we have to look at some of those practicalities that led to the creation of the race disparity unit, and also, of course, whether what's happening now will give new impetus to it. So could you
let me tell you
about that, and then we'll move over to David.
The genesis of the race disparity audit was a coming together of leadership, Black leadership, me and others, and the Prime Minister. And I said to her, look, for things to work right within government, you have to, again, I talk about being bold and brave. You have to lay bare those uncomfortable truths. They're not nice, they're not pretty to see how people are disadvantaged. Lay them bare. And actually, I think it was David Lammy that did the mantra. I just stole it from him. I mean, no point inventing the wheel. When he did his review into racism in the criminal justice system, explain these disparities was the mantra, or change. Explain or change. So we said we need to look into every Whitehall department, education, health, criminal justice, housing, lay bare the uncomfortable truths, put all the data on a website, and then go to ministers, explain or change. Actually, it's rhetorical. We know we need to change. The worry now is, will this government embrace that, or will they say, because it belonged to the former Prime Minister, we won't give it the attention? It is critical. There's been kids on the street today, yesterday, all around the States. They're looking for two things primarily: leadership amongst themselves and amongst us, and hope. Hope that we can be big enough to construct a framework with the race disparity unit and other elements and a grand plan. We've been arguing for a COVID-19 race equality strategy that will look to these areas. Today's meeting by you and by Raymond, I thank you for it. And I want you to tweet, I want to social media. Our handle is OP Black Vote. Tell the world that we are together in this, and we will build a brighter future.
Thank you very much, Simon. David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I appreciate, we all appreciate how much in demand you are during this critical week. David, I wanted to ask you how much you feel has changed. We forget that before 1960s, we didn't have any race relations legislation in this country. And we really have, people say, we've been pioneers in that legislation that came into effect in the 1960s and more so in the 1970s, actual legislation to outlaw racial discrimination. Do you feel very much has changed during that time? And do we need to go back and revisit what we created then? And part of that was a creation between different groups of people, Black people, white people, Jewish people, to say that if we're going to really be serious about tackling racism, we have to do it. We have to use the law. What's happened to that idealism, all that rigor that we put in those years ago? How do you feel things have changed?
Well, look, let me thank you so much for asking me to join you and to speak really in the spirit of a united struggle that the Black community, and particularly those who've been colonized and those who are the descendant of enslaved people and the Jewish people, have had in these common struggles for a significant amount of time. And I'll come back to that, I hope, shortly. But to answer your question specifically, there's no doubt about it to me that the country into which my father arrived in 1956, where it was routine to have overt acts of racism on the streets as he walked about his daily life, where it was routine when you went for housing, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. He actually often said that you could often only get housing where you had Jewish landlords, by the way. It was an era long before Roy Jenkins, and there's no doubt about it that that equalities legislation begun a tide in which overt individual acts of racism were outlawed, and in which we created an environment where that was no longer the case. However, it is also the case that here in the UK, as in much of Europe, there is a very serious reckoning, and that reckoning is with a colonial past in which my descendants were enslaved people for hundreds of years, and in which Europe and Britain was at the center of that, created a system, supported a system of scientific racism that allowed Britain and other countries to go out and colonize much of the world and create, if you like, a pecking order. And it's that I'm afraid is terribly systemic. And whilst it's easy to look across the pond at the still overt acts of racism that are present in the United States and the perennial struggle between the descendant of enslaved people and those in the largely white establishment in parts of the United States, I think it is incumbent to be absolutely clear that that story did not begin in the United States. Indeed, it began in our own country and is still here today. And so when people, what I get a sense of when people look at George Floyd, when I listen to Al Sharpton so powerfully say, get your foot off our necks, and when I express that phrase alongside others of, I can't breathe, people want to breathe. When we look at this moment, and perhaps this moment is amplified because of coronavirus, and I mean that much of the world is at home, much of the world is watching the news and watching television, much of the world is social media in a way that would not have been the case when others have died, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin. There are many cases, travesties in the United States that have not quite kicked off this moment. I think that it is also the case that both in the United States and here in our own community, it's now become quite hard to be a person of color and not either know someone directly or know someone who has died during this crisis. But there's also a collective grief to understand in the Black community. I've lost a classmate that I was at primary school with. I've lost an uncle in New York. I've lost 6 folk at my local mosque, 20 at the other mosque. I've lost my chief rabbi in the Haredi community, Rabbi Pinter. So now I'm in a particular position, obviously, as the MP for Tottenham, but it's just to give you a sense of the grief that exists in these communities, and then the sense, I'm afraid, that there is an overrepresentation of Black and ethnic minority people in these numbers, and there still is not the justice that we want to see in our society. So I think that the systemic issues remain perennial issues in our society. I was asked to do, as you know, a review into this by David Cameron, but the action, the response to that review, the speed at which the government have moved has not been as I would have wanted it to be on the area of criminal justice. And there are lots of other areas, you know, and that's, I think, what is happening. And I hope that we can remain united in this fight to deal with this, this terrible, terrible evil that's holding people back. And in the end, at the heart of it is a supremacy, is a sense that one group of people are more important or should be preferenced over another. And at the heart of it is also power. And, you know, the great struggle of the 20th century is that struggle, but on behalf of people at the beginning of that century who really had so little power and certainly weren't able to self-actualize, to be who they want to be in their lifetime. And by the end of the 20th century, whether it was Black and brown people who'd been formerly colonized, whether it was women fighting for control over their destiny and control over their bodies, whether it was gay men and women, whether it was working men and women who started the 20th century down the pit, down a mine, on the factory floor with very little rights. By the end, because of great men and women like Martin Luther King, Mandela, Gandhi, Emily Pankhurst, Harvey Milk, and others, by the end of the 20th century, rights were more in reach. But the struggle continues. And let me just say too, that the struggle continues as a historic struggle that has usually meant that certainly the descendant of enslaved people and Black people have joined arms with their Jewish brothers and sisters. And so I think it's really important at this critical moment to remind this audience of that rainbow alliance that has existed between our two communities because of our historic pain and our understanding. And that's a historic pain, of course, that's also a biblical pain. You know, we have a biblical understanding as well, if you like. But the situation of exile, the familiarity of tropes. There are tropes about Black people, that we're lazy, that we're not bright, sexually promiscuous, violent, fear are the tropes about Black people. And there are tropes about Jewish people. And very sadly, in the last few years, we've seen some of those tropes rolled out about power, hoarding of wealth, mean, conspiracy theories, and all the rest of it. And we understand those tropes, we're attuned to them, we see them. And we've, generally speaking, been empathetic and able to see what's going on when they are deployed. And it's just to say, finally, because I saw a question aimed at me that was about what can Jews and Blacks do together? And it's to remind this audience. And I took a moment just to look up some of the books I've got, just to remind myself of these great names and to remind you that, you know, Jack Greenberg was the Jewish rights attorney to the NAACP Legal Fund, that Henry Moskowitz was the co-founder of the NAACP, that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel marched with Martin Luther King in his 1965 march on Selma, that Joel Joffe was the lawyer who defended Nelson Mandela at his trial, that saw him jailed for all of those years. And of course, the relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community in apartheid South Africa is well known. We think of people like Helen Suzman, Jules Broad, Arthur Goldrich, all these great people who stood with Mandela and others in the ANC in that coalition. And indeed, as we saw civil rights come in this country with those acts, again, it was Jewish lawyers, Jewish lawyers who supported Amnesty International and those sorts of organizations. So there's a historic bond. This is an important moment. At this time, people are making appeals to Black Lives Matter, to who can I support, how can I support? So I'd want to tell my Jewish brothers and sisters there's much that you can do and we should stand together.
Right, and we'll come back to that, and I hope find some specific ways that we could work together. David, I just wanted to ask you, do you feel this moment, which in many ways feels quite unique, other ways quite scary and surreal, do you feel that the anti-racism movement is actually going to be reinvigorated now? Reinvigorated in such a way that people will understand that it isn't just about justice for Black people, but reinvigorated in a way that it's going to lead to a better society for all of us, because we know if there is proper justice, and if, in Simon's words, we have a new 1945 moment.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. But I want to be a bit challenging as well. Minorities are in a position in this country, and Black minorities are in a position where the phrase that you're constantly hearing in the Black communities, we're tired, I'm tired. Simon will hear that, I'm just tired. And what that really boils down to is I'm tired that I have once again to make the case for whether structural racism exists in this country or not. And personally, as David Lammy, I'm not tired, because I can't be tired on behalf of the community I represent. But you'll understand that, once again, tomorrow morning, I'll be on television and I'll be asked, is there racism in Britain? Have you experienced racism in Britain? And frankly, the discussion, I think, that has moved on for Black people is no longer us that should have to make the case. There is a feeling that this is actually a subject for a majority community to get to grips with, to examine, to wrestle with, to understand. I had one of the, I won't say which, but one of the TV stations ring up and ask me if I wanted to do a documentary on Blackness. And I said, no, thank you, because actually, I think the time has come for a documentary on whiteness. That's the documentary that needs to be made, and I'm not the man to present that. So there's a sort of weariness that has set in, but the joy and the hope is that when you look at the protesters, they're Black and white. Yeah. Yes, there are lots of young people, but they're actually people who are much older as well. Again, Black and white. And I found in the last few days, despite being at this business now for 2 decades or more, I've had text messages and emails from people who would not describe themselves as liberal, who would not describe themselves as progressive, good people, but getting on with their lives, people who certainly would not feel generally literate and comfortable with some of the language of anti-racism, really, perhaps because of the lockdown, wanting to understand, saying, what books can I buy? I had a call this morning from a philanthropist saying, I'm quietly already supporting young Black children in the inner city. What more can I do in your community in Tottenham? Who can I give to? And so things have cut through. And that's something to be joyous about if it can be sustained. But as you know, the media will move on, the news cycle will move on, and we've seen it before. The news cycle is on, and then it's all sort of forgotten. And that's the challenge when you're talking about a minority, and that's different to the United States, where the numbers of Blacks and Latinos and others mean that it's harder to push this issue off the news cycle. And indeed, I think because it's clear that Donald Trump is doubling down on hate and on supremacy because he thinks it might keep him in office, it's very likely that things will be very noisy at least up to November.
And finally, before we invite the audience to give us some questions. Could I just ask each of you to briefly say, let's go back to the theme of this evening, Black Lives Matter, solidarity. What does Black Jewish solidarity actually look like? What does it mean? Besides the phrase, the words, how do we turn all of these things into really concrete action? So, April, what does Black Jewish solidarity look like to you?
Ooh, I've written whole resources on this. So what I would say in short is, as was just beautifully mentioned, you know, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was mentioned, and he is a guiding light for me in this work. And I want to mention this interesting thing. I've wanted to write an op-ed about this for years, and I haven't done it. Maybe Nadine, you can field it. Basically, every year in the United States, there's an article that's written saying something along the lines of that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy has been whitewashed. And I want someone to write an op-ed about how Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's legacy has been whitewashed. And so in this moment, when I am in a tough position, when I am in a top senior leadership role at a major Jewish institution, and my sisters of color who may not be perfect, but are brave and bold and leading liberation work in this world show up and ask me if I will be there for them, I often think, what would Rabbi Heschel do? And I am crystal clear in that moment that he would show up, that he consistently showed up when it was not popular, that he consistently pushed the line when it was the right thing to do, and when he was clear that there was alignment around values and purpose. I think one of the core things that our community can learn from or shift right now in this moment at times, and there are parts who have already done this, this isn't a universal statement, is that people aren't perfect, people make mistakes. And what I will say is that as a Jew of color in the United States, there is a consistent amount of racism I tolerate on a near daily basis. But I see the humanity of my fellow Jews. I see that having been raised in a synagogue, a core part of my justice framework and social consciousness and being politicized, I can't get the word out right now, it's been a long week, politicization, I don't even know if that's a word, has come from being raised in the Jewish community. And yet, in this moment, I think that there is a need for us to dig deeper, to really dig in and say that we are, in fact, in this together, and to not mistake proximity and listening with agreement. Just because we are listening and in relationship doesn't mean we agree on all things, but what it says is that we understand that we have a shared connection and stake in our collective future together, and that those are things that can be negotiated. I know we don't have a lot of time right now, but I just want to say very briefly that I think in the past 40 years in the States, that there has been, when I look at quotes from leaders in the 60s and 70s, Jewish leaders, there was a lot of nuance that's missing. People would say things like, and this is kind of inflammatory, but still I think it's an excellent model. We're noticing an internal memo from within, I don't remember whether it was the AJC, the American Jewish Council, or the ADL, I think it might have been the ADL, and they said, we are noticing that there are elements of anti-Semitism rising up within the Black Panthers movement. So we're going to be sending in a spy, but we don't want to take any major action right now that could possibly damage the fight for racial justice, and we want to remain in relationship. And I think that there is a need to hold that tension. I think part of the reason why those leaders did that is that they were more proximate to the Shoah, and a lot of those leaders, when they were born, weren't classified as white in the United States, and they experienced far more oppression. But since that time, there's been 40 years of conditional whiteness in the States. And I think our community's understanding and analysis around oppression has gotten condensed in the States. And I think that we need to strengthen that analysis, and through that show up more powerfully and understand that we don't need to agree around everything, but we will be present. And through that process and through that relationship, we will collectively grow and move forward together. Thank you.
Dean, the situation here between Black and Jewish people, what do you feel solidarity looks like in the UK?
So I think I'll focus on Jewish organisations and institutions. I think, first of all, it comes to just thinking of Black Jews, like the fact there are Black Jews out there. There are Black Jews in the UK. I talk about the election a lot, but this was the kind of an emotional moment for me. There wasn't any real consultation or reaching out to the Black Jewish community. I think an important part of Jewish relationships with the Black community is to start with Black Jews and seeing how you can be there for them, and then from there you'll be able to know how to be there for other Black people. So that can come down to representation, although I think it's very different in the States, because the Jewish community is bigger, and by default there are more Black Jews, so there's not very many in the UK. But such as things like what you've done here, inviting us on panels, or if you're going to write an article in the JC, or you're going to have a meeting about, I remember there was a meeting about the far right back last year, and I was kind of pushing to have a Black panelist on it because there wasn't one, and I got into a bit of an argument with an organisation because I was like, come on, you need to have at least one Black person on that panel. So for me, I think it's representation. It's not just saying, oh, we care about Black people. It's about actually talking to Black people, because it can become a bit of a, oh, you know, I do care, but not enough to find the Black person to talk to or to have on my panel and to listen to their voice. And I think also about recognising, as David mentioned, the kind of shared struggle of tropes, and the fact that it's the same sort of, the racism and the bigotry comes from the same place, although they may manifest themselves differently. You can't claim to be an anti-racist if you're tolerating racism to Black people, or you can't claim to be an anti-racist if you're tolerating anti-Semitism. So it's about recognising that, you know, you have to stand up to all forms of hatred. And I do feel, particularly as we talk about the election, at the last election, there was just not any real level of concern for the Black community about what the election meant, what it could mean for the Black community when it came to racism, etc. It just wasn't discussed enough. I tried to get it discussed more in Jewish circles, and it didn't happen. I think this will be a turning point. I hope so. I'm trying not to get my hopes up too much. But yeah, and it's just fundamentally about listening, I think, as well. So representation and listening, because people don't listen enough. And yeah, I think that's what I've got to say.
And hopefully the conditions are such now that what you've just said, people will be listening and hearing, which perhaps they weren't doing even a few months ago.
Well, that's exactly the point. And I think when David was saying I can't breathe, it does feel like you're kind of suffocating, and you've been saying this stuff for ages, and you've been saying, listen, please, this is happening. And you know, there are people on my Facebook who I've mentioned some of this stuff to before, and they're only listening now, and it's great that people are listening now, but please don't just get distracted and then go back to how you were before, because it'll make it even more painful, because people will know exactly what they're doing and how it feels, but then they'll be doing it anyway. So as David said, it feels like we can't breathe, so if you can give us some air and listen to us, that'd be great.
Simon,
Well,
what does solidarity look like?
Well, I think like Nadine, we have to be optimistic. I mean, actually, I think that is the Black experience and the Jewish experience, if I may say so, that we never give in. We're resilient, we're strong. But as David suggested, we're a bit tired too. And what I would like in terms of this interconnectivity is for Jewish people to say to us, your struggle is our struggle.
Yes.
I'll say to the Jewish community, our struggle is your struggle. And the starting point of that conversation has to be, as difficult as it is, honesty. So we have to say, we have our two Black Jewish sisters here. And I know as a Black man that instinctively, I know that they're catching hellfire every single day on so many different levels. I don't even know where to begin. And it pains me, frankly. And so if we're having this solidarity, if we're having this honesty, that I would want our Jewish allies to be asking themselves, are we doing right by our own Black fellow Jews? And I'm talking about Falashas in Israel, I'm talking about African-American Black Jews. Are we doing right by them? Straight, honest, brutally honest. Because you have to get your home right first. And then alongside that too, we have to say to ourselves, it's in our shared interest that we open up equalities. open up potential. Because when I'm strong, you're strong. When you can do business with me on an equitable level, I can do business with you. And we must come back to the starting point. This is a moment in history. We really, really mustn't forget that. And I don't know how we can embrace that enormity without being shackled. People say to David, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And me and David will say, well, how long you've got? We can tell you. First of all, I want you to say, what can I do? But don't just say it today and then go back to normal tomorrow. It's an opportunity and we mustn't lose it.
David, some final words from you.
Well, let me just say what Simon has said about this is our shared struggle, our shared pain is so important. You know, why is it the case that it is, if when we study the Second World War and the atrocities in Germany, as we do in all UK schools, the murder of Rhineland Black people is not discussed? That's a pain. It upsets me that I never knew that until I was an adult. It upsets me that for so many in my own party, that understanding certain truths around anti-Semitism was not there in recent times. And it upsets people greatly that it's still the case that here in the UK, the understanding of not the abolition of slavery, which is well understood in Britain, but the fact and what happened during that period. What happens when you strip a people of their culture, of their identity, of their names, and how that ricochets on through the generations. Why are Black people historically poorer? Because they were made poorer, because even when they were freed with no funds. And then, of course, here we sit as we see this horrible virus affect us in even larger numbers. Look, there's much that we can do, there are wonderful organizations like Hope Not Hate in this country that actively support the fight against both the discriminations that affect our community. We need more of that. And JCORE is a wonderful historic organization. We need more of that. We need to deepen it. We need to renew it in places, bring on new generations of people. We need shared forums to educate one another. And we need shared campaigns. So it should not be just Black people campaigning for this subject in the curriculum. We should see you as real allies in that fight. The last time I was on a platform with you, JCORE, was discussing the Windrush, raising funds to support refugees. It was humbling to experience and to watch. It really moved me, because at the time I was meeting many, many Caribbean people who had no money, who had been stripped of money. Indeed, I tweeted just yesterday, you can look on my Twitter file, a legal fund to help people fight racial justice. It's now standing at £17,000. Well, any of you who are loyal know that's not a lot of money, but it's raised a bit of money. So there's lots of things that we can work on together, but a lot of it centers on education and then the shared fight that we must take to the powers that be.
And I'd like to think that JCORE with JW3 can think about how we could take this conversation forward, because there's lots of things that have to be done on all sorts of levels, and how we're going to sustain all of this when other items become the central pieces of what the press.
But can I say this, and this is obviously political, there might be some who take a different view. I do believe that the fight up to November in the United States is a very significant one. And it's my judgment that if Donald Trump were to get a second term, that has a significant impact on the world and on the subject that we care about. It's also my judgment, by the way, and I can't read a crystal ball, but I can say this, and I think history confirms what I'm about to say, that of course, after this coronavirus comes the recession depression. And I hope I don't have to tell anyone who's participating in this tonight that we know historically that where we get recession depressions, we get those who seek power and deliberately try to attach the economic hardship that people are experiencing to those amongst them who are different. And the Jewish people have experienced that at its most pernicious, and Black and brown people have experienced that. And I think it's very unlikely that just as we saw this hate accelerate after the 2008 crash, and so catastrophically, we now have more recession and depression coming on top of that crash and austerity that flowed, that hate and racism and anti-Semitism might not amplify in these circumstances. And so, look, the empirical evidence is in front of us. We just have to look back at history and look at what's happening to recognize that we need to raise our game.
Yeah.
We need to raise our game over this next period. And literally, I would say, people's lives depend on us raising our game.
Absolutely. And we're going to certainly see it in both countries. I know we've run a bit over, and it would be wonderful if everybody would be happy to stay for another 15 minutes to take some of the questions, because we've had a quite patient audience, though we wouldn't know if they weren't. Michaela, do you have some questions for us?
I do. Thank you, Edie, and thank you to all of you. So I have one from someone called Sargam Picker, who has asked, is addressed to April, and he's asked, you were talking about making reparations for centuries of slavery and the generational effects of it. My question is, how do the panel envisage these reparations coming about, and what might they look like? And then as an extra, if that is, you want to include that, how might the Jewish community play a part?
It's an excellent question, and this is a very live, so thank you for the question. And this is a very live question within the Jewish community in the United States, particularly within the Jewish social justice field. I feel very proud to say that it's very much underway and people are in a different place with it. I think it's best for me to speak both a little bit in terms of what I know about what the movement is recommending in this area, the broader movement for Black lives, as well as my personal thoughts and reflections on it based upon my expertise and lived experience. To me, I think it's critically important that we meaningfully, as a society in the United States and as communities, engage in these conversations fundamentally. And personally, from my vantage point, there are a number of ways. I think at times people get overly fixated on, say, pardon me, I might be speaking out of turn, but I think at this point it's something like, officially, if we're being real here, like $1 trillion worth of wealth that Black folks are owed for the free labor that they provided for 400 years, and what that has grossed over since the end of slavery and since the inception of slavery. That being said, this is a huge conversation, but I know that there is a move, or that there are policy recommendations, for instance, coming out of the movement for Black lives, recommending that collegiate education and perhaps also other professional trainings, that it would be excellent if the society could offer those for descendants of enslaved Africans for free for a number of years. That there are different measures that could be taken that would move us in the direction of tikkun, of repair and of powerful acknowledgement of what's happened. So there are people who are policy wonks or policy experts in this field. I am not one of them. But what I would say is that I think at times, because of the enormity of the issue, it can be a little overwhelming. But if one begins to do some research and look up the work of different scholars, not just people just kind of, as you would say, it's like talking at the side of the mouth. I'm not talking about that, but a number of Black and allied scholars of other racial and ethnic backgrounds who have done extensive thinking in terms of the economics and the social and economic viability of different policies. And so whether it's, again, not a movement for Black lives or other sources, that's something I would say. And what I would conclude by saying, and pardon me for speaking quickly, I try to be thoughtful about language liberation, and I know that I'm the one with the funny accent on this call, so just let me know if I need to slow down. I just want to make sure I get to hear the insight from my fellow panelists. Lastly, as I started to say, and I'll conclude by saying that this isn't, there was a very exciting move, for instance, recently out of the reform movement, my former employer, the Union for Reform Judaism, specifically the Religious Action Center, where they approved a policy this year around calling for there to be a commission around this conversation related to truth and reconciliation or restorative justice and reparations. So there has been a move as the movement around racial justice within the Jewish social justice field has particularly caught on within the last 3 or so years. There's been decades of work with Edie's partner across the pond. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice has been around now for over 20 years, but there has been a move that has been led by Jews of color and our white Jewish allies to bring this conversation into the Jewish social justice field, and it's starting to seep into the broader community. So it's an active conversation. There are tech studies that rabbis are leading around this, and in conversation, it hasn't gotten to the point of fully crystallizing, but it is an active process that folks in the States are engaging in around calling the question and saying that this does need to be brought to the table in a political and powerful and meaningful way.
Another question, Michaela?
Sure. Let me go to the next one, which is from Danny Braverman, who is less optimistic than some of the panel about upcoming events. But he asks, given that it's unrealistic that our government will do anything substantial to tackle racism, what do the panel think of the viability of a People's Assembly for Change, modeled on the kind of work the Irish did with abortion and equal marriage?
So the Citizens Assembly.
I'm very keen on citizens' assemblies. I talk about them in my last book. I'm not sure that, citizens' assembly can arrive at a place where there are sort of sticky policy solutions to sort of try and forge. I think what we're talking about here is social justice, and actually a lot of what needs to be done has been written about ad nauseum. We know what needs to be done. It's just that people are not keen to give up power to make it happen. So I'm not sure it's the best solution in relation to this, but I am keen on the model of People's Assembly. I also don't want to be too bleak about the government. I think that tides of concern are important. All governments have to take them seriously. And so the coalition that we're talking about here of black and white is fundamental. And no government wants to see a generation of young people and their parents turn against them, believe me. No government wants to see that. And so, don't underestimate the power of protests, the power of civil disobedience, the power of being united in the fight for racial justice.
Oh, sorry, David. I think as part of that, it's really important for the Jewish community to amplify its voice to government that things have to change, and I think we need to join with others in making sure that message is heard.
Yeah, can I just say that this didn't quite come out before, but one of the problems we've had with this banner term BAME, which means nothing, Black, Asian and minority ethnic, and then the Jewish concern about anti-Semitism feeling, I know for some, as if it was just a Jewish concern and it wasn't shared sufficiently widely, is there has been a sort of atomization and a sort of siloed approach to some of these amongst communities. And I do think that this is a moment, this moment is definitely a moment in which we can put that to one side and fight shared battles and be articulate about the broader umbrella that is that Rainbow Coalition.
I mean, I would argue something much stronger, because whether it's the USA or whether it's the UK, unless we have major surgery to our institutions, to our politics, to the way we do business, let me tell you this: we will have more George Floyd deaths, and we will continue the shocking lockout of Black and brown people, both in the States and in the UK. That's a fact. The only question now is that how serious are we for that fundamental change? Will we see it as a moment, or will we put a Band-Aid on a wound that needs surgery, deep surgery? Assembly's fine. You know, whatever targets you've got, have a look at them, throw them in the bin, and double them, quadruple them, because we were just tweaking around the edges before COVID. Real deep surgery is going to demand commitment. And here's the other thing too. Your caller said, well, no one's listening. Look, we have democracies. And even this democracy, even ours and in the States, cannot avoid ignoring when tens of thousands of millions of people take to the street and make demands. They cannot ignore it. The only question is, come back to what I said before, what will you do? How will you respond? And if we all respond together, I have to say, I'm a little bit more optimistic.
Should we take one more question, Michaela? I'm quite aware of time. And I think, as I said at the beginning, that this was hopefully a start of a much longer process, of a much longer conversation that we should have been having for a very long time. And we have to think critically of how we're going to take this conversation into other areas that will hopefully lead to the change that we know is needed.
Sure.
So to say that this is then just, you know, part of a process, and if we take one more question, and then obviously continue the many questions that people have, but it'll obviously have to be in another form.
Okay, this question comes from Ben, and it's an echo of a few different questions that have come in. We've sort of amalgamated it, but also there's been a lot of thanks for the whole panel for such a generous and enlightening discussion. So a lot of that, which I want to echo. And something which has come in is that what about the anti-Black racism that exists within Jewish community? Either those that hold racist opinions or don't recognize the institutional racism and don't see the need for change. And what role should synagogues and Jewish institutions play in addressing this, and also universities and the Jewish Union of Students now that universities are closed, which I guess is a specific extra for Nadine in particular, but I think all the panel could answer.
So who would like to kick off with that one? A very big question.
I would love April. April, do you want to go first?
Discussion.
I would let Nadine to go first if you're comfortable. I think you're best suited to answer this first.
Okay, so when it comes to anti-Blackness so it's really hard being, honestly, a Black Jew in the UK because there are so few of us. Just to give you a silly example, sometimes when I need to go to a kosher shop, I feel a bit awkward about going because I know I might get stared at, and things like that. So I think it's hard being a minority within a minority, and also being a minority that's already quite marginalized in society as it is. I think one of the things that the Jewish community, as a community, the Jewish community can do is just to educate kids and their communities the fact that there are Black Jews and that we do exist. I mean, it seems this weird thing where in the UK we talk about the existence of Black Jews in Israel, or, you know, far away, but like not as if we don't have Black Jews here. So that would be a start. And also, I think just going back to the whole thing where just teaching kids, if it's a cheder or, you know, shul, having, you know, rabbis just talking about the importance of solidarity between minorities and things like that. But when I don't know how you address an issue like how do you handle anti-Blackness in the community when it's almost more of a symptom of the broader community, a broader situation with whiteness. I feel like the othering of Black people in the Jewish community is just the way in which it's othered in society in general, but it's more intense because it's within a smaller community. So I guess what I'm trying to say is just listen to what Black people are saying and implement it within the Jewish community, and recognise that the Jewish community aren't, you know, completely aren't entangled in this racism, because by virtue of the Jewish community being Ashkenazi, quite white, you are. Because, and although I understand that Jewish people have a different relationship with whiteness because of their Jewishness, and that's a whole other conversation to have. And I think it's important not to just, I think there is a difference between like an average white person and a Jewish white person, but it's also recognizing that when it comes to skin color, there is that level of marginalization within the community. And it would be nice one day to be able to go to Kosher Kingdom and not get stared at. So that would be a nice day for that to happen. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. It's a bit rambly, but April.
Yeah. I thought you were crystal clear. So what I would add to what you said is that I think fundamentally a shift, so that's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked it. I think it's actually relatively rare for there to, it does happen. It does happen. My family has personally experienced it, where there is explicit, unbridled anti-Black racism. But what I find is more common is bias and a few different things. And this particularly I find in the Jewish community, because of a history that we do genuinely get to be very proud of. I think at times we mistake, and I have like a visual of my, I'm using with my hands here, our values, that we conflate our values with our actions and how we're showing up in the world. And I think it's true that both, we may have incredible values around equity and justice, but that doesn't mean after acculturating and blending in and assimilating into societies that were inherently racist and inherently were inculcated deeply with white supremacy, that contamination didn't seep its way into our people. I don't think the Jewish people ever thought, oh yes, we are entering this racist society, we too would love to be racist bigots. I don't think that's how it played out. But I think in trying to gain access to survive and in trying to be safe in a society that was inherently racist, that got into the water in our community. And so I think we need to get that out by noting a few different things. One, fundamentally, is that all of us, all Jews, need to begin to consistently see ourselves collectively as a multiracial people. That Jews are a global people. We started in North Africa and the Middle East, and we have lived all over the globe. We are a global, racially and ethnically diverse people. And even as white Ashkenazi Jews, you get to claim part of that inheritance as well, and claim that as your self-conception of who we are as a people, right? So I think that that's a great starting point. And from there, that begins to shift the whole conversation around, of course, we would engage with Black Lives Matter, because that is part of our people. That is a part of literally our history and where we come from, right? And so that begins to shift out of this polarization that white supremacy has caused and starts to help make us access shleimut, or wholeness for ourselves. And so I think that is huge. And lastly, that as we do this work, to be open as Jews and to leverage the technology that our tradition offers in terms of tikkun and teshuvah. Teshuvah often described as redemption. I love that the root of teshuvah literally means to return to our inherent goodness, and that when we do this work, that we have a crystal clear understanding that we are attacking the racism and the oppression, and that there's us and our inherent goodness as individuals, and then there are also our behaviors, policies, actions that need shifting, and that we can hold that both and, that duality of our inherent goodness and that we're fallible humans and we need to tweak that. And so I think, I don't have a pretty bow to tie that in right now, but I think that those are my remarks. Oh, well, I remember. And the last thing I would say, if it's okay, if I may make a little bit of a plug, to say that on my website at joyousjustice.com, you can get a resource where I go through 10 Jewish values, guiding principles to move Jews forward toward racial justice that are rooted in our values that come from me as a multiracial Jew. So it incorporates Black liberation theory and restorative justice and combines it with our Jewish values that speaks to some of these fundamental principles I'm talking about, that leveraging our tradition forward to move forward in a way that holistically embodies who we are as a people and how we need to show up in this work for our wellness and for our collective shared future.
Well, thank you very much. And just before turning over to Raymond, just to say on behalf of JCORE, what a pleasure it's been to work together with JW3. And I hope that this will only be the start of a longer collaboration as we really dig deep into these issues. And we hope as well to be working with other organizations within the Jewish community, because I think this has given us a new opportunity, which we can't afford to kick into the long grass. That obviously the time is now to make this sort of changes and to remind ourselves that these changes benefit not only Black people, but of all of society, if we have a fairer, more just society. So thank you on behalf of JCORE. Thank you very much. Thank you to JW3, and over to you, Raymond.
Thank you, all of you. How do you follow that? There's a few thank yous to make. First of all of you, our incredible panelists, for giving us your time, your expertise, your insights, for being frank, for being vulnerable, and for being inspiring. Particularly to our Black brothers and sisters, Jewish or not. I know as a white leader, I can't always turn to Black people and say, you have to give me the answers. I know I have to do more, I have to read more and learn more and listen more. So I really appreciate you giving your time. And I can't begin to imagine how exhausted you are talking about it. I know how exhausted I was for the previous 2 years talking about anti-Semitism anytime anybody wanted to have a conversation with me. So if it's anything like that, I just really thank you. Edie, thank you for being such a key leader in the British Jewish community on issues of racism, and for deftly chairing this evening's event with skill and tact and aplomb. I want to thank JCORE for regularly partnering with JW3 on issues of racial justice and equality and refugees. We will do more together. And thank you to my brilliant JW3 colleagues. It's my face you see, but behind the scenes, Deborah, Joe and Michaela have done all the work for pulling this together, for leading me and for driving conversations within our organization. And now I'm going to look directly at you, the couple of thousand people across the Jewish community and beyond who are watching this in Facebook watch parties, and JW3's Facebook page, on YouTube, on Zoom, everywhere. My messages have just been non-stop for the last hour or so. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for showing up and being part of this conversation. But here's the thing. If we now just pat ourselves on the back and say to ourselves, well done, we white Jews, we showed up to listen to some Black people telling us, job done. And then we go back. Then we at JW3 will have utterly failed. As Nadine said, we can't just listen now and go back to our lives and carry on as normal. Our aim with this event was just to be a trigger for greater, more honest, more urgent conversations. And then for those conversations to be the triggers for action, because we all know that ally is a verb, right? It's a doing word. We know that. It's active, it's not passive. In order to be allies, in order to be truly anti-racist and not just non-racist, we, everyone watching at home, myself included, we need to do more listening. We need to do more reading, have more conversations, however uncomfortable some of them are going to be. And they will be uncomfortable in our community. I know that, they already are. And we have to create stronger, better relationships with Black Jews and Black people of all faiths and no faiths. We have to play our part in dismantling the systems of oppression and racism, however we are able to. Because some of us, I know I do, have a position of privilege as a white, male, middle-class Jewish leader in this country. I have a privilege and I need to use it, and I need to work out how to do it better. So for our part of JW3, we are having deep conversations about what other activities and programs and events we can put on for the Jewish community. We're in conversations with some phenomenal Black Jewish activists, amongst others. And I want to thank Lara in particular, who I know is watching, for her time on the phone with me again today. As Simon said earlier, every single one of us needs to stand up and be a leader right now. And as David reminded us, there have been white Jews at the heart of every major anti-racist movement in modern history, standing hand in hand with our Black brothers and sisters. So if you're one of the couple of thousand people watching this right now, please stand up, take a leadership role, get involved. And if you've got suggestions of programming that you think is appropriate for JW3 to do, be in touch. I promise we'll listen. I can't promise we'll be able to do everything, but I just want to finish by telling you, we have 6 core values that guide everything we do. They are so relevant to this conversation. It's kihila, community, hachla'a, inclusivity, yitzartiut, creativity, chesed, loving kindness, shituf pula, collaboration or partnerships, and dugma ishit, leading by example. We want to lead by example. So thank you so much for joining us tonight at home. Thank you to the panel. Everybody, please stay safe, look after yourselves, and look after each other. Good night.